everybody, I'm Vicki, creator of If the Stitch Fits, Wear It. And today we're going to be learning how to make bias tape. So what you need for this project is a ruler, scissors, a bias tape maker, a great piece of fabric, and an iron. So let's take a minute to talk about the importance of bias tape. Bias tape comes in handy for a lot of different projects, and you're going to find yourself using it a lot. For example, this shirt that I have on, I use bias tape for the collar and the sleeves. The most important feature of bias tape is the stretch that it gives your fabric. So I mentioned the most important feature of bias tape is the stretch that it gives your fabric. So if you have a piece of fabric in front of you, give it a test. Just stretch this edge right here, that's right in front of you, and you see you have a little stretch right along that edge, right? So now take your fabric on this edge and try to give it a stretch there, just the way it is. And you see you don't have a whole lot of stretch in that angle. So where do you find the bias? Okay, it's not as hard as you think. Your bias is actually on this diagonal angle of your fabric. So you got a little bit of stretch along this edge and not so much stretch on this edge. But if you stretch your fabric on this diagonal angle, go ahead and give it a stretch, and you'll notice you have a lot more stretch on that diagonal angle. So let's make bias tape. So the first thing that you want to do when making bias tape is take as much or as little fabric as you want and fold the bottom edge up to meet the top edge so that it makes a triangle. So I'm going to take the bottom half of my fabric and kind of slant it to meet the top half of the fabric, making a triangle. And try to line up your edges more neatly than I'm doing. And you can see I have my triangle. Just straighten that out. And my triangle is right here. And I have this extra fabric over here, which I can just cut off because I really don't need that. So I'm just going to cut that right along the edge. You can use a roller cutter for this too. They work really well. I'm just cutting right along the edge of my triangle. You see that? And I'll save this for another project later. So now all I have is my triangle here. And on this diagonal angle, or the bias, if you give that a tug, you have that extra stretch that you wanted in your bias tape. And that's the important part. But before you do anything else, you want to cut these two triangles in half along the bias edge, or the diagonal angle right here. So I'm just going to take it and cut right on the edge. Can probably find a better way of cutting that than I did too. All right, so now you have two separate triangles here, and what you want to do is take the bottom half of your triangle and fold it to this edge of the triangle at the top. And this is still your bias edge right here. And take that and line up your bias edge with the edge of your cutting mat right here. And this being your bias edge is parallel to your cutting mat. And then what you want to do is take your ruler, and I'm actually going to switch to my roller cutter now because it's actually more handy than my scissors and I get a better cut out of it. So let me just go grab my cutting edge. So now I have my roller cutter, and I am going to measure 2 inches apart on my fabric. So I decided to switch to my quilting ruler, which you certainly don't need. You can just use a regular ruler. This just helps me because it has the slits. It has the slits right here that I can cut through. And I just kind of wanted to use this because it helps me measure out my fabric the way I want. So I don't know if you can see that, but right along the ruler itself, it has right where you should be cutting. So if you're using a regular ruler, that's perfectly okay. I'm just gonna use this because it helps me measure a little bit better. And I'm gonna measure my bias tape 2 inches at every interval. So at my 2-inch mark, I'm just gonna cut right up this edge at 2 inches. So you have your bias tape perfectly cut, and what you have here is 2-inch pieces of bias tape all together. And the first thing that you want to do before you start your project is to stitch together the pieces of the bias tape that you need for your project. Alright, so let's get started with that. Let me first show you the wrong way to stitch your bias tape together. I do say wrong way because there actually is a wrong way to do it. The goal when you stitch together your pieces of bias tape, look at that stretch right there, see that? Okay, the goal is to get a straight line out of the pieces that you're stitching together. But this is the wrong way to do it. To lay each fabric on top of one another and just stitch across is the wrong way to stitch together your bias tape pieces. What you want to do to accomplish that straight line is take your bias tape pieces of fabric, leave one so that it's right side up, take the other so that it's wrong side up, and you're gonna make another triangle at the top of the first piece of fabric, right there. And if you can see that well, hopefully, you see that I lined up the edges of both of my fabric, and I still have a little piece of this triangle hanging over each of the fabric, which is completely okay because once you stitch it together, you're gonna cut these 2 little bits of triangle. But now look at this. Once you stitch at 1/4 inch along this edge, it is gonna make a straight line. And that is the right way to stitch together your bias tape pieces of fabric. So I am gonna take this over to my sewing machine and just stitch 1/4 inch together right along that edge and cut the triangles that are hanging over the fabric. Okay, so I have here the 2 bias tape pieces that I did stitch together, and now I have a perfectly straight line of bias tape. Good job, pat yourself on the shoulder, you did great. But you're not done just yet. So now what you have to do is fold it into the bias tape that you want to use. So you take your bias tape maker, and what I'm gonna do is start on the back side of it because if you can see there, it has that little hole in the back of it, and that's gonna help me get my fabric through. So I'm gonna take my little seam ripper just for the purpose of getting the fabric through the bias tape maker. So I'm gonna start it on the back side and put my fabric in right side up and just help it through the bias tape maker just like that. And I'm going to turn it back on its right side and pull it through. And now, as you're pulling it through the bias tape maker, what you want to do is take your iron and iron it all the way through, all the way to the end. Just pull it through enough to get it through. And just make sure it's folding and straightening out as you pull it through your bias tape maker and go all the way to the end of your fabric. This can be pretty relaxing for a good afternoon. And you know what I forgot to do? Was to cut those little edges off of my fabric, the little triangles that were hanging at the edge of your fabric. Just make sure you cut those off because I forgot to do it. And what you want to do also is cut the extra fabric beyond your stitches, not cutting through your stitches. So I'm just going to cut that extra right over the stitches, not cutting through my stitches, but just cutting the extra fabric right there. And I'm going to continue to iron it so that it's a single fold piece of double tape, or bias tape, I should say. You just want to make sure that it's actually folding because sometimes it'll get jammed in your bias tape maker. And you can just pull it through. Just like that. All the way to the end of your fabric. Perfect. Good job. All right, I hope you're still with me. So you still have one more step. So now you have a single fold of bias tape that went through your bias tape maker. Now what you want to do is take your bias tape and fold it in half again so that you have double fold bias tape. But what you want to do actually is take, when you fold it, take the one edge and fold it just above the bottom edge. So you don't want to line them up, you just want to fold it just above your bottom edge. And then that way, when you do stitch your bias tape, you're going to stitch along that top edge that's just above the bottom edge. But when you stitch it, that's going to make sure that the bottom edge is being caught in the stitches. And you're going to iron it so that you get a nice crease. And now you have made double fold bias tape. So good job. I hope you enjoyed the class, and if you did, remember to hit like and subscribe and come back for more classes.